Hello, Matthew here from the British Baseball Podcast. Just been speaking with Andrew Taylor from the Folkstone Baseball Chronicle. I had an absolutely fantastic time chatting with him. Reviewing the audio, it has some issues and dips in and out. Shouldn't affect the whole episode. The quality is just a bit iffy, but I just thought I'd let you know before you crack on with this. But again, thank you, Andrew, for a great insight into what you're doing, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. You're listening to the British Baseball Podcast.
Yeah, not bad. Busy week at work, still working from home. Actually, pretty much took a week off of my baseball research. So it's very rare I give myself a break. It's almost every night there's something or a lead that I'm following up. So just taking a bit of a breather. But it's all come flooded back in. In my inbox this morning, a few emails from New York and the likes that need to get answered. So it begins again from tonight, I think.
Sounds really interesting. Like I for one, absolutely love what you're doing on the website. What's your process of working like then? Like how? Well, I suppose we could go back to the beginning. Like what exactly is the Folkstone Baseball Chronicle?
Sure. I mean, the genesis of that sprang out of the fact that I already loved baseball, had an obsessive passion for baseball. About 20 years ago, when I was at university, I took a summer job with the local library here in Folkestone, and they had an archivist, and we're very, very lucky that the Folkestone Library had archives that went back over 100 years, and somebody in the 50s had the sort of foresight to literally save tens of thousands of documents, photos, anything that was being thrown away by local authorities, sports clubs, schools, private houses. He just collected everything and over the decades catalogued these things. And there was a new archivist in about 2000, 2001. And he just had so much there to try to get in order, and they were looking obviously to digitize in the future, and they just needed some assistance. So it was a sort of summer job, going through lots of brown boxes and folders and envelopes. And there was one particular day I was searching through the newspaper clippings and everything sorted in these envelopes, and there was one catalogued under baseball. I thought, oh, fantastic, lovely. I'd like to have a look at this, see what we've got. And it was fairly new, it was fresh. There was only one article in it, and there was a letter from Canada. A gentleman who said my grandfather, or my father, I think it was actually, had been a Canadian soldier, had been based in Folkestone for a great period of the First World War, and he had a picture of him playing baseball in Folkestone. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. I never knew about this, and I've lived here pretty much all my life, and my father's was a renowned historian as well, and I'd never heard of it. It was a story that I hadn't heard of, and of course it ticked all my boxes anyway as for the love of baseball. And I was talking to the archivist about it. It's actually an ongoing project. This is I can't really find much about when this game was and what was going on. I don't really know the area, but I think I found the match report that corresponds to this guy's father, and
Wow.
We found it. And he said, want to do any more digging around, please do. And of course I did. They had all the old paper copies of the local newspapers. There were two major local newspapers in circulation at the time, which were all hardbound. And over the course of that summer, I literally read 5 years worth of newspapers. And I found that it wasn't just one game. It wasn't just this isolated game of Canada versus the United States, which is how his father had told him it was. But there were hundreds and hundreds of games, going all the way back to 1915, when the second Canadian division came to Folkestone. The first division had been based on Salisbury playing during the winter. It had rained for about 100 out of 120 days. They didn't play any baseball. The second division came to Folkstone because the local garrison had brick barracks, and it was much better to accommodate them. Doubled the population of the town almost overnight, 40,000 to 80,000. And the Canadians sort of set that as their headquarters, as their military headquarters for the remainder of the war. And that spring, within weeks of them arriving, they established a baseball league. And none of this was known. None of this was known. And I mean, just the year 1915, for example, there was 52 match reports printed in the local newspapers. And what was particularly special about that year and those match reports is they named all of the players. So you could identify the team that they were playing for by the regimental number or the battalion number. You could identify their names. And about 5-6 years ago, the Canadian government actually opened up all the Canadian military service records to the public for free and said you can just search through it as well as you like. And this second division, when they came over, they joined together, they trained together, and they went off to fight together. They weren't split off into reserve groups or into other units. This was a unique sort of division that kept the sort of its unity throughout the history of the war. And so we found nominal rolls through like a register of these people when they left Canada. It's just sort of ticking off, saying, "Yep, this person left Canada on his way to England." And you had the regimental number, the service number, where they were born. And suddenly you could start to build a picture of actually who these guys were. This wasn't just yep, nice, it was a game being played. We can pinpoint who these people were. And it became a bit of a quest to find out more about these guys. Did they play baseball in Canada? Were any of them major leaguers? Were there any major leaguers in Folkstone? That was my secret hidden thrust. And what I found, actually, the story was much better than that. It was much greater than that. So it became about telling the story of baseball in Folkstone that just wasn't known locally, was not known locally, spreading it out a bit more into the world. There was a big passion in Canada for what I was doing, big interest in what I was doing. And with that, the elephant in the room was the fact that actually baseball was already present in Britain. It wasn't brought over by the Canadians and by the Americans later in the war. There was already a distinct baseball history in Britain. And during the First World War, you've got the London Americans, a civilian baseball team, who mostly weren't American, they were mostly British, and they were mostly members of the London Baseball League. And they were sort of carrying the torch still for British baseball. And this just must be an amazing. Hundreds of teams coming over to play really top competitive baseball. And it also sort of that. And I started off really I had all the research material collected over the years. I wanted to start telling the stories, getting more information about them, even reaching out and finding some of the families and descendants of the Canadians. And it became so much more. It became so much more. And it's intimately connected with history. And with the history of baseball itself. I mean, just to go off on a tangent, one of my favorite stories was that the first major league to enlist in the First World War was a Canadian, Billy O'Hara, who played for the New York Giants for a couple of years. And he was playing minor league baseball when the war broke out in Toronto, the Toronto Maple Leafs, as they were then. And he was on the field at Hanlon's Point when Babe Ruth hit his first professional home run. I think Babe Ruth would have been with the Orioles. And at the end of that season, probably he'd seen the future, decided it was enough for him, and he enlisted, and he ended up in Folkstone. He ended up playing with, or serving at least with a very sporty battalion that had a lot of baseball going on. So it was just all these little stories that began to pop out, and even outside of baseball, there's something like 15 members of the Hockey Hall of Fame, the Ice Hockey Hall of Fame, lived in Folkstone at that time for a good period of time. They didn't have as much opportunity to play their sport, but I could go on. I could go on for hours, as you know. That's where the genesis of it was. It's kind of grown from there to encompass baseball history itself, and really, there's a narrative. The popular narrative at the moment is that you had the famous league, of course, in 1890 up in the Midlands, You had the beginnings of London baseball a couple of years after that. Then you had the London Baseball League, and you kind of got this gap until the 1930s when the golden, what I call the golden age of British baseball was.
Yeah.
And people kind of look at wartime as, yeah, it's great. Canadians were playing, Americans were playing. What did it do to develop the game locally? And a lot of people don't think it did. And what happened in the 20s? Nothing much. And I actually kind of dispute that. I actually think, you know, the Canadian, the American influence showed how popular the game could be in terms of attendance. It also spread the game out to parts of the country that had never touched before. What I would say out into the provinces, it really took it out far and wide. And that did have a knock-on effect. I mean, by the 1920s, the Chipping Norton team, of course, in Oxfordshire, had kind of sprung up quite independently of what was going on in London and what was going on in the Midlands and further north. And there, you know, that was a significant influence. And the continuation of baseball in London in the 20s and then into the 30s was really off the back of the Canadians who stayed behind after the war. And carried on their love of the game and did as much as they could at the time to promote it. And of course, there was governmental politics going on at the time that many different leagues weren't coherent, weren't brought under one umbrella body. It wasn't really until the 30s that did happen. But it's not the wasteland that people think. It's that period, 1910 up to 1932, is really fascinating. And you know, there was a lot of baseball going on, a lot of people kind of keep that flame alive. Anyway, I've rambled on.
No, that's fine. This is what I'm here for. This is the content that we want to hear. All the fun bits. So you mentioned before that it was quite secretive in Folkestone baseball. Why do you think not many people knew about it, especially like the population doubling and quite available?
The Canadian aspect, the Canadian presence and history in the town has continued to be celebrated to this day. So Folkstone celebrates Canada Day officially every year. You have a military cemetery just outside town. It's a war grave cemetery. And every year on Canada Day, there's and it's happened every year apart from one COVID year and a couple of years in the Second World War. Local school children go attend the 312 Canadian graves and lay flowers on them. It's a very moving ceremony that's, again, not so known in Britain, but in Canada is very, very well known. So there's always been a knowledge of the Canadian history connected to the town. It just feels that nobody had really looked into baseball history, the sporting side of it. I mean, in 1915 alone, and this is without exaggeration, Folkstone was the center of North American sports outside North America. So you had baseball being played to a fairly good level. You had Canadian rugby, which was a gridiron game, and it was still in its formative years. You had lacrosse being played. You had roller hockey, which today we would much more recognize as inline hockey or polo. All these sort of sports going on just congregate in the finale. And I think nobody really has ever looked into it since. And that's a tragedy. That is a tragedy. It's part of the tragedy, I think, as well, of British history, that there are so many more stories out there that still aren't known. And I know there's some questions you might want to touch on about how we get those stories out. And you have to start somewhere. And that was my mission. Start local, and then, as I said, the elephant in the room is what was going on still in Britain and what had gone on previously.
That's brilliant. Really interesting. That you mentioned before that you really you're really passionate about baseball. Andrew, how and why did this fascination and this passion come around? What was the spark for you? Where did it all start?
The oldest was a big fan of all things. When I was 8. I think she participated the first time, and she came back from New York loaded with gifts for me, lots of Yankee stuff, but also some incredible tales from the Bronx. And she sort of put the kernel there. For some strange reason, and I don't know why, I've been reflecting on it the last couple of days. I already had this consciousness of baseball. I already had this awareness of the game. I remember quite clearly playing grounders in primary school, but visualizing myself on a baseball diamond. And yep. It was sort of childhood fantasies. But I do remember that. I recall that quite strongly. So she came back from the States, these wonderful tales, and a real passion. She had a real passion for the Yankees as well. And that kind of rubbed off. And then when she got married, again, I was probably only 9 years old, she moved into a flat nearby. And she was one of the first people in the area, I think, to get Sky at the time. I remember it was just coming out at that point, and the satellite dishes, of course, were massive, and subscription units weren't far behind. And I had a sleepover. It was a school night, a sleepover at her flat to take me to my primary school in the morning. And I was a notorious night owl. I wouldn't go to sleep. And I'd make all sorts of excuses. And karma has sort of caught up on me because my son's exactly the same. But we'd have all sorts of excuses as to why I wouldn't go to sleep. And I remember one night she said, "I'll tell you what, here's a compromise. I'll put the telly on. And you can have the telly on in the background. We'll turn the volume down, but you need to go to sleep. You can't keep getting up. You can't do it." And she said, "What would you like?" She's flicking through the movie channels and she's thinking, well, that's not going to be appropriate. 8, 9-year-old at the time, whatever films are going to be on at that stage weren't going to be for me. And she chanced on Sky Sports, I'm assuming it was, and there was a baseball game on. And it was September. I remember it clearly. It was September. It was the run to the end of the season, and it was Yankees against the Blue Jays. And this was the time when the Yankees stunk, absolutely stunk. And I remember the game being on, and I didn't go to sleep probably till 2, 3 in the morning. I still went to school the next day. She didn't know that. But I remember just absolutely, I was fixated on the game. And this was the first time I think I'd watched a game live. So I had an awareness of it. I knew that this was the Yankees anyway, but I absolutely loved it. And the great thing was, with the volume off, I had to learn a lot about trying to make sense of the game without commentary, without explanation. And of course, you've got your stats line running across the bottom of the screen, which I absolutely loved, and still to this day, the statistical side is something I really enjoy, and the sabermetrics. So that spurred my initial interest, and I never lost it. I never lost the game from that point. And she'd end up. There used to be a weekly. A week, I think, that they did on Sky, ran for an hour, and it was really an extended highlights package. And she would take these all for me on the old VHS tapes and get them popped over to me on a weekly basis. And of course, it was a great era. I mean, everyone has their favorite era and their favorite players from a particular era. And at this time, although I was a Yankees fan, it was Cal Ripken. He was my hero at the time, and he was coming up to his great landmark in the stroke, and the Iron Man, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by it, and fell in love with it there and then. And she'd be drip fed the sort of the live material I needed. To help with that, I was very lucky. The secondary school I went to, just a state school in Canterbury, nearby city from here, had acres and acres of playing fields, quite unique for a state school. And we were really lucky with the amount of space that we had. And one of our PE teachers had come back from the States. He was about 14 at the time. He'd done some coaching over there. He'd had a sabbatical. He'd got some coaching skills. And he'd managed to secure funding to start a softball and baseball program in the school.
Oh, wow.
So they had a purpose-built diamond. They had the room to have a purpose-built diamond. I mean, again, not many schools have that had a purpose-built diamond, got the equipment in that they needed, and really pushed it as part of that everybody would play anyway, as part of physical education. And that was great because it's inclusive, but also it took it serious to the point of wanting to be competitive have a team out there. The team was very, very strong, and I was in the first year, the original team. And so that was a first transition from baseball fan to player, getting to experience the sights, the sounds, the smells, and every person who's had any association with baseball will pick up the sound that they most like, or a particular smell, some sense into the game that always draws them back. And those at school, exactly the same for me. So I had a little bit of playing there, and then that love never went away. That love never went away, and we were lucky in the late 90s and into the 80s to have baseball on terrestrial TV as well. So I've had that constant, never quite a fix. There's never enough, but I've had that constant involvement on a fan level, and also participation. I got the bug when I was a kid, and I've shook it off.
Cool. Did you ever give yourself a try on the field yourself? You ever played for a local team in Britain?
That time, now he's Kent having it. Obviously, Kent does have a history that goes back a number of years, and particularly in West Kent and the Tunbridge area, of course, and they did start to establish a couple of teams in East Kent off the back of this, off the back of my school. I think some were in Herne Bay, Whitstable, and I was on the periphery of that for about a year or two. And then come university time, I sort of took a step back from it, really. I don't mind. It's one of the, if there was a regret, that would be it, but I didn't play more. Played a few scratch games since, of course, but in terms of organised baseball, that's by university time. Played a couple of games there. That was it. It just wasn't very well advertised at the time. The club scene in the area, and I think that's something that there are parts of the country where there are sort of lack of, aren't there? Where people don't realise just how much baseball is played where the nearest club is. And I know we're making, great moves have been made towards rectifying that. So that's, part of why telling the story is important as well. This isn't an innovation. And I think a lot of people in this country to this day, if you told them how much baseball is being played, would be shocked. And they'd go, wow, that's a novelty. That's like, no, it's not. It's been going on for over years, and there's various strongholds as well where it literally has been going on for that length of time unbroken near enough. So it's that's part of my mission as well. I feel part of my mission is to let that be known out there, and so that future generations can appreciate how much baseball is played, find their local baseball teams. It's all connected.
Yeah, cool. You've talked to length there about how passionate you are about it and everything. But why is British baseball history so important to you?
This is a good question. And it's a love of the game. There's talking generalities about the game. It's a very egalitarian game. We know today, of course, how it's open to, it's accessible to all. It doesn't have, if you like, the class connotations that cricket used to have, and to some extent still does. British baseball history, it's just that story is just not well known enough. And that's what I think makes it even more interesting. That we almost have a responsibility now to let these stories be known. It's pride. It's pride in the British baseball community.
Yeah.
Pride in our love of the game. And I'll give you and I think it's a general malaise anyway. I'll give you an example. I was on a forum the other day, an American baseball forum, just contributing to a conversation. They held a poll. Who invented baseball, or who should be credited as the inventor of baseball? And these were fairly well-educated baseball fan in America. And the vast majority voted for Abner Doubleday. And you're like, oh my God, I mean, we all know that that myth has pretty much been blown up a long ago now. But it was fascinating to see that the conversation then turned within the forum with some American writers and what have you contributing, saying, well, no, it wasn't Abner Doubleday, it couldn't have been. And these are the historical reasons why. But also, let's have a look across the pond, let's have a look across the Atlantic and look at proto ball that was being played in Britain, in and around the London area. And you know, it's a game that has such a big fan base, such a lot of love and passion for it. The mystery of its origins obviously adds to its mythic, but it's also a bit annoying. I think, you know, that we can tell that story a lot better. And I think British baseball has that double-pronged advantage that we can lay claim really to protocol, to the origins of baseball, of having some roots here in this country. And that's not, I know some people have actually announced that and put that out there, and you know, that still needs to be put out there a lot more. You know, we contributed, if you like, to the of baseball across the world. It then came back to us, was gifted back to us by the Americans in the 1880s, 1890s, and we just have a duty to tell that story. And I think my passion for the British baseball story, apart from just the love of the game, is not enough people know that story. Not enough people know that story. And a recent thing that I've helped put out there, a film from 1911, which, you know, we might talk about a bit later. It's fascinating to see the responses from some football fans, because of course a lot of baseball was played on football grounds, who were absolutely loved it. They were going, of course, but they were, and they were all, wasn't actually the football clubs associated, was it? And you're saying, yes, it was. Tottenham had a baseball team. Fulham had a baseball team. West Ham had a baseball team. And no, they weren't all Americans. And there was a lot of home talent. And that story just isn't known. And that's where the tragedy is. That's where the tragedy is. And as for the reasons why that was, you know, there was a little hatchet job 100-odd years ago in the media. You know, baseball was seen as a foreign influence, as an invasion, and as something of a threat to the cricket establishment.
Yeah,
it wasn't. The cricket establishment didn't really mind. They knew it wasn't side by side. And you look at Australia as an example at the time, and it really did complement, you know, the two complement each other, and their press took the completely opposite. You know, they really were positive about it. So I think we have to undo that historical bias that has lingered on there. I don't think there's so much negativity, but it's still very as a novel or as innovative or a bit of American influence trying to creep in. It's not. You know, it's been here for a long time. It is homegrown, and we should be proud of that. We should be singing that from the rooftops, and that will help generate interest and growth in the game.
Yeah. Do you think that's the biggest myth then surrounding British baseball?
You mean it's American basically, from that's outside of influence? I think so. I think so. I mean, a lot of responses to that film from the British Baseball Cup finals, and people were interested, fascinated. But yeah, it was almost that's
good.
Really to do.
There's been quite a lot of people involved in trying to get British baseball history documented. There's yourself, Gabriel Fiddler with Veterans UK, Joe Gray with Project Bob, Gary Bedingfield's done some history books, Josh Chetwynd as well with his work, and Harvey Soccer. How do you think we can get more people interested and involved in baseball history in this country? Do you think it's just a case of looking into your own team's background and then bringing it to light, or what do you think?
I think so. I think, as I said, my initial writing or research area was local. It was very localized about baseball being played in Folkestone by Canadian soldiers. But that expanded. I mean, they did play against London civilian teams, not too far up the road in Thanet. The Royal Flying Corps, as it was then, they developed their own teams. They sort of picked up the game. That the Royal Navy in Southampton game as well. So a lot of it became a lot of English military teams or British military wanted to get involved in as well. So we know that it did have that influence, that spread, and that carried on into the 20s as well, and into the 30s actually, with the RAF. Just again going on a tangent, saw a photo the other day of an RAF baseball team from 1938, 1939. Never seen it before. It still had that lingering effect. Of course, by that time, the golden British baseball, a lot more people would be involved, of course. I think, yes, local. You'd be surprised when you dig down just how much is being local. And East Kent hasn't got any clubs at the moment, but it has a rich history. So you've got the leagues in World War One. In Thanet, you played in World War Two, but in Thanet you had RAF Manston, a US air base, playing in the 50s and the 60s in the Southern League, the British Southern League. You had the Snowdown Magpies, which were a miners team, the Snowdown Colliery in East Kent. They were all miners, and they were literally brought to the game because one of their colleagues was again a soldier from the Second World War, stayed behind, got married, and they said, "Hey, you know what? Let's set up a baseball team." And they reached out to a US Air Force team in Manston. Got funding for equipment, and the Magpies were a prominent team for a couple of years again in the area. And people don't realise this. It's almost forgotten history. That's sad, but yeah, I'd say start local. The best resource is things like archives, and you can search out era, and then first World War, the influence of the Americans, how it was spread out further into the than the local game, if you like, from British. So there is rich scene history to be done, and it's too much for one guy.
Yeah. What's been some of the most interesting things that you found in your research?
It also really. The guy called was a Canadian soldier, Richards. He pitched the first military game in 1915. Which was a military league in Britain. And that was the front of everything that grew into the Anglo-American Baseball League in 1918, which was effectively we had major leaguers playing in London on a regular basis throughout the summer of 1918. And this guy, Richard Rogers, he played in 1915, played again in 1916. He was a left-handed pitcher, we know. And it disappears from the record. And then looking at the service records, he actually went over to France. Survived unscathed. The only injury he had, it was an infantryman, was involved in a lot of actions. The only injury he had was a sprained knee. So I suspect it could have been a pitching injury, we don't know. And he re-emerged in 1919, so after the war's ended, playing for Team Canada against Team USA in Paris, and something that was the Inter-Allied Games. It was like an Olympic Games that was purely for soldiers, veterans of the First World War, 5-game series. So he had the unique distinction of being at the very first military baseball game of World War One and the very last one, and played quite a lot in between. And he's a fascinating character because the local paper in Folkstone alludes to the fact that he was a professional. And I can't find anything about where he played in the States. If he was indeed a professional, it could have been alive. And the most curious thing is we know that there's fabrication around him. He's enlisted army as a Canadian, said he was born in Montreal. He wasn't. He was from Pennsylvania. But at a time when American soldiers weren't allowed to join Canadians, where they were neutral. So it looks like his lie was facilitated for him as well, because he's got his correct place of birth, Jonestown, Pennsylvania, scratched out by the sergeant and replaced by Montreal, Quebec. And I know they still live there. I know your descendants are alive. I'm still trying to reach out to them. It'd just be fascinating to know where he played, what level he played at in the States. But there are some other really fascinating characters. There was a guy who played in Folkstone, the engineers, called Harvey Reilly, who was semi-professional in Western Canada. Pretty well. And his brother, his older brother, ends up joining him over here in 1918, and he wins the Canadian Championship of England and then the Baseball Championship of the British Isles, which was again the military, but it was the Canadian military against the American military. And his name is Jimmy Reilly. He goes on to become the first and to date only guy to have ever played Major League Baseball and in the NHL. His first pennant was actually won in Britain. His very first baseball pennant was the Canadian Championship of England. So,
brilliant. So, who are some of your favourite people that have been involved in British baseball throughout history? Any notable characters you want to talk about?
I think from that period, from that particular time, a guy who doesn't have as much credit as should is John Gibson Lee, or J.G. Lee. He played for the Tottenham Hotspurs during the London Baseball League. He became secretary of the league in its dying days. And once the London League sort of collapsed, he still retained that role. As we know, the National Baseball Association still existed, and he still retained that role. And he seemed to be constantly working away at trying to get funding to establish baseball again. And just even the First World War, he's still playing. He's still playing for London Consolidated Nines, representative teams from London, mostly against ranches and rodeos that were traveling over here for different shows, sort of exhibition game stuff. But he's still playing, he's still passionately plugging away to try to get the game firmly established. And just on the cusp of the war, he announces that the following year they had the plan to resurrect the league, again based on affiliation with football teams, but this time, instead of being London-based, to be entirely national-based. So they'd already had advanced conversations with football clubs in Manchester, across the country, to try to do it. And what was different this time, he was saying, was that they had financial backing. They'd been underwritten to the tune of £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, a lot of money at the time, which was the great failure of the original London Baseball League between 1996 and 1911 is they were expected to turn over a profit. And for a lot of these games, for a lot of these guys, they were novices. They'd picked up a bat and ball before. And yes, they had coaches. Yes, there were American players as well there who were able to assist them along. But it was a very low standard of baseball. Very low standard of baseball. This was something that was commented upon by American observers as well. How low the standard was. And that the average fan didn't have much knowledge. They looked at a close game, a 2-1 game, a pitcher's duel as almost boring or unexciting. That sort of filtered off into the press. Whereas a high-scoring game where 30, 40 runs are scored, was absolutely brilliant. And yet purists would say, well, that's not really good baseball. That's some very bad defense going on. That's some very bad pitching. But that original league, despite having its low standard, was expected to turn a profit because the football clubs were hoping that by getting baseball fans in during the summer, it would help sustain their finances, use of leagues. And that didn't happen. They didn't get the numbers they wanted consistently enough to make that kind of profit. And Lee had realised this. He realised that sort of fundamental in the original league. It was great to have the association of the football clubs, but the expectation that they must turn a profit, do the result. And so in 1914, he said, "Yeah, we've got all this money that's raised." And Arlington Crane involved, of course, in the 1890s, was one of the big drivers behind it. And of course, the war interrupted, so we never found out whether it would have succeeded or not. Personally, I it would have done. This is required travel for a truly national league at that stage. Maybe a cup, knockout tournaments, absolutely. The full season of league baseball. But he was a fascinating character. Of course, when the war comes and goes, right, let's stop the London Americans. And he's then playing exhibition games against Canadian teams. He secures big grants. Now, the Canadians were going to play baseball whether the English were interested. And it wouldn't have mattered if nobody turned up. They were playing because they wanted to play. Their love of the game. The fact that there was a baseball community already in Britain, the fact that there were enthusiasts as well, helped. It was kind of a synergy between the two, that they realized they could work together to provide what was an entertainment package. They could not just recreation, entertain spectators. They could make a lot of money out of it, which was all raised for war charities. And you're looking by 1918, the 4th of July game at Stamford Bridge, 40,000 people attended. I mean, that was the best attended baseball game until London Series a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
A lot of work went on to it. And behind it, engineered a league in 1916 where he said to the Asian Army, well, I'm not running leagues, but I've done one in London. And we're going to have a team, and we're going to play against these Canadian teams, and we're going to bill it as America versus Canada. As I said, most of them were English, but they were quite happy calling themselves the Americans. And pretty decent. They managed to achieve quite a decent standard of baseball. They were, if you like, an all-star team of 4 London League members. And by 1970, he managed to recruit Arlie Layton, of course, the famous major leaguer from the New York Giants before, to play. He'd come over, said he's a correspondent. We don't know, we can't find any paper articles to prove that he ever did write about anything. He joined them, started coaching them. And of course, he was a driving force between the Anglo-American Baseball League the following year, that, as we said, effectively a professional league with a lot of major and minor leaguers there. And Lee was still hanging around the game in the early 1920s. There's photos of him playing for London Americans at Oxford University. But he sort of appears from the history books after 1920, 1921. He kind of kept the flame alive of London baseball. And a period when it really was lowest ebb, he'd managed to, through the London Americans, through contacts with the old London League players, just keep that game going. So that once the Canadians and Americans did leave at the end of the war, or the following year, there was still a passion to carry on playing baseball. And various London leagues carried on into the 20s, through the 20s. And he's a big part of that. He was a big part of that. So he's a fascinating character. Absolutely, love to find out more. I think his story is to be told a bit more as well. You've got other guys, Charlotte Moorhead, who took over from Lee in the 20s with the London Americans. He stayed behind. He played in the Anglo-American Baseball League. So he played against major leaguers. There was no threat that he was ever of that standard himself. He definitely wasn't. But he'd played against some of the best that he could at the time. And he continued playing for London throughout the 20s. And he got a lot of support from strange sources. So Percy Fender, who was the captain of the Surrey Cricket Club, hired him to be a fielding coach for the Surrey County Cricket team.
Wow.
He wanted to bring in terms of throwing and catching into the game. And that received a lot of attention. London Beatles comes up lists of history again to reappear in the context of cricket or a different sport. And I mean, Fender ends up playing the London Americans a few games as well. There's some pictures out there of him suited up in baseball. Fitting it in between his cricket career. But more guy who hangs around until the 30s, part of the London Major Baseball League.
Yeah,
he's at that formative stage. But a character kind of lost a history. And the British one, Harley Latham, is one of my favourites, of course. As I said, major leaguer, plays for the London Americans in 1917. Even the 1920s and 20s, he's still turning out to play for London teams. And he stayed in London until the early 1930s. In letters home to America, he calls himself Commissioner of British Baseball. He had some influence in bringing over the Giants, the Chicago White Sox in 24, which was a repeated tour they done in 1940. A lot of that. He's very friendly with King George V, and got that sort of royal patronage. But again, it's hard to underemphasize that patronage effect it had on the press. Being very dismissive, almost hostile to baseball before the First World War. In the 20s, when they realised actually the King's a big, passionate fan of him, and he's attending many of his games and friends with Harley Latham, the tone of the press changed. It kind of sets, if you like, the scene for the golden age of 1930s, when the hostility is ceased and it really embraced big style. And again, Latham has a big part to play with that. I mean, Latham probably, I've seen tantalising bit of evidence, probably succeeded in bringing Ty Cobb over in 1929. He just died. And Ty Cobb came over to play an exhibition game in London at Wembley Stadium for the Americans. The game was shut down by the police before it started because it was being played on a Sunday. But Ty Cobb still put on a one-man exhibition of baseball skills, which was photographed. And again, it's such a loss to our history. Nobody really knows much about, and yet Cobb is one of the iconic, figures of that era of baseball, and played over here, and it's a tantalising play, probably a couple of days away from actually playing a game in baseball. But Latham, such a big influence. I think a lot of what he did was under the radar and was in the background, and he used his influence positively to help develop him. This is just sort of said to you earlier, the consensus that after the London Baseball League in 1911, really not much happened after the 30s. The reason I kind of dispute that is there was a lot of things, grassroots things going on that hadn't been going on before.
Yeah.
It was a case of rebuilding from the bottom up. And so when you start finding that, you see the Charlie Moorhead who say behind for Harley Latham, what J.G. Lee did with the London American as well, is that there was a continuity actually between the 1906-11 London Baseball League and then what happens in the 30s. And if you can actually see that there's that continuity between those two eras, that there was these same people involved, that community existed, even if it was, in its doldrums, it was still there. You can actually do the same backwards. So, well, actually, the 6-11 Baseball League had its roots in the original, the London Festival in the 1890s. They, in turn, had connections with baseball being played in the Midlands, with the Derby counties, the Aston Villas. They had connections with them. And you tweeted recently some of the great sort of cup final scores between North and South from the 1890s. These things didn't happen in as much isolation as they did, but the community probably was still there. And then you can then go from the 1930s forward and say, actually, there is that continuity all the way to today. There is that continuity all the way to today. Yes, it's been kept, yes, it's been growth in some areas, losses in other areas, but the basic community of British baseball has survived against the odds. I'd even say it's thrived. It's in a growth position again. And there is continuity. The guys of the 1890s, the guys of the 1920s, 30s, are all part of a family tree. And I think we owe it to remember them, their contribution to the game, and to promote it in the same way as today's stars will be remembered.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. Wow. Yeah, superb. You also uncovered some footage recently as well that you put onto the Folkstone Chronicle Facebook page. How did you discover this video? And do you want to tell people who may not have seen it what the actual footage is?
So the footage is the Bristol Cup final from 1911 between Leighton and Crystal Palace. It was the last game of the London Baseball League before it collapsed. Let's just put it straight out there. It is the oldest footage of baseball being played outside of North America. And we are pushing towards Cooperstown, the Hall of Fame, to recognise this. The previous holder of this record was a game from 1915. Funnily enough, a Folkstone-based team against the London Americans at the Lord's Cricket Ground. So it's nice that there's a distinctly British one from 4 years before. This was brought to my attention by a film collector, a vintage film collector, who'd had the original movie tape. I'm not very up on the technical side of it, but of course the movie tape used at that time is very volatile, and a lot of film taken at the time has been lost or destroyed or damaged since then. He got hold of it, didn't know what it was. I think it was unlabeled. Put it onto an original projector. When that looks like, but that is baseball. That looks like it's in Britain. And of course, the caption made clear it was in Britain as well. Said, I never knew they played baseball in Britain. I never knew they played baseball at this time here. And he restored it. He restored the footage, got it preserved. He's managed to have it digitized as well. And he started, this was a couple of years ago, he started looking into what actually is this game. Was this a wife? Was it something more embedded? And he's come to realize through his online searches about just how well established British baseball was. And he reached out to me a few months ago and introduced himself and his interests. He said, can I ask you a question? What is the oldest footage of baseball outside of North America? Well, easy, 1915, September 11th. Well, the anniversary was passed, Lord's Cricket Ground, London against Shorncliffe. However, he said, I suspect there are older films. I've got newspaper articles that say that there were previous games recorded. And if I send you this link, can you keep it to yourself? He sent me this link. And straight away, I knew the significance of it. And this was the 1911 Baseball Cup final. It was the last game of the London League at the time. And it features some of the prominent characters of British baseball at that time. William Drummond, who was best pitcher at British baseball of that era, still has the sort of Victorian era pantomime villain mustache. It's unmistakably him coming down the set. And we know from the match reports that he did, he played, he pitched. And you get an idea for how he pitched. That he was probably just very limited in his repertoire, was probably just a fastball pitcher, but not averse pitching at the head. There is footage, of course, of a batsman being knocked to his feet. And the catcher there, again, British ball. So William Jarman was British ball. The catcher, Marsh, was British ball. Guys who'd been around for a long time in Britain. So it was great. He found it. I sort of highlighted to him just how important that was. I said, we've really got to share this first for the British baseball community. This is a unique piece of British baseball history. But also with the world of baseball, it does have a really important. It's a landmark in world baseball, and for that era as well. It's on the right at the end of the dead ball era, on the cusp of the dead ball era. So Babe Ruth really is a turning point in baseball history and the style of games played. And it's great to see dead ball baseball being played, and being played in Britain and uniforms as well. Such, I think Crystal Palace's hats for the games a lot like the Pittsburgh Pirates pillbox hats as well.
Yeah.
It was great to see. So yeah, we have to share it out. Actually, the online community has been really into it, and that's been great. Has helped out as well, and now that we're trying to push this over and get recognised on the international level. Because again, it's a growth to British baseball history, to the British baseball story, and we were proud of what has been achieved in the game in this country. And this little crown, I would hope.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I hope it does. You're successful with that, and you'll have to let us know how you get on. That's brilliant. I honestly feel like I could chat with you all day with this, but unfortunately, I'm coming up to the end of our time for this episode. We'll have to do some more in the future. So that brings me down to the last 3 questions. We're now in the bottom of the 7th, I'd like to call it. And with these last 3 questions, you're either going to strike out, or you're going to load the bases, and then you can walk them off. So the first question is: do you have any hidden talents?
I used to be able to throw a knuckle.
You used to be able to throw what, sorry?
I used to be able to throw a knuckleball.
Oh, right. I misheard that when it came through the speakers.
So after my playing days, I was back out for knuckleball. I still gloves and balls, and I was running a club at the time. It was before I had a long bar. It took pitcher's mound to home plate. Perfect. And before I opened, sometimes I just yeah, after about 10 years, I finally got the test shape.
Brilliant.
That was talent. I don't think
what are you most afraid of?
I don't know. I try to confront any fears.
Okay.
In life, I always try to confront it. I had a passion for mountain climbing when I was younger, height, those things. Ironically, I'm probably more scared of climbing a ladder than I am a mountain. Other than the more banal thing I have to provide for family, I don't do much.
No, that's
Afraid
cool.
of not being able to watch baseball again.
Yeah, I think that freaked most people out. Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Lots of guilty pleasures, actually. Yeah. So, on a personal level, I love all sorts of music and play a lot of music as well, but for some reason, and I don't know why, it resonates with me. So, much to my partner's embarrassment, my son's embarrassment, a particular type of day and a particular mood, that's it. Abba's being blasted out, all full whack.
Nice. They got a new album coming out soon.
They have. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Nice one. Brilliant. Right, I'm having that. All bases loaded. Time for you to walk them off. Andy, thanks very much for being a guest on the show. It's been a pleasure. It's something I've been after for a long time. So thank you for filling this dream. You've been a great guest. I hope the listeners will agree as well. Some fantastic insight into some British baseball history again. And so the floor is all yours. It's any shout outs, last word is the guests. So over to you.
Yeah, a couple 3 names that I really want to Josh Catamol, who was the guy who found the Michael 11 baseball film. I want to shout out and thank him for reaching out to him. He spread that. He deserved a lot of credit. He saved that piece of baseball history. In British baseball, I want to thank John Carter and Neil Reilly for a very specific years ago. Arranged a couple game here in Folkstone, featuring Canadian armed forces in the UK against Buccaneers. Neil was very helpful in helping me reach out and make contact with a lot of British baseball at the time at a good level. And John was receptive to us coming and playing. For something that was organised in a very short time from scratch. And the other name that I'd shout out there is Jim Wick, the American author.
Yeah.
Baseball author. He'd always wanted to do a really he's got a lot of bureaucratic obstacles. He passed it back and he said, "Do you think Folkstone could do it?" We did to work together on it. So, it's a real scratch in the space for us. And I'm going to throw out one other name, a guy from the Blue Jays called Leo Mui, who encouraged me all the way along, opened up Canadian audiences to me as well, and also sent over some league balls for us to use in action and other gloves and equipment. Baseball is just this one great community, and I'm grateful for every member of the community.
Yeah, likewise. Well said. What a great way to end the episode. Andrew, thanks again. All the best luck. Where can we find your work on social media? Lovely. Thanks. And that's the Folkstone the Folkstone Baseball Chronicle. Thank you very kindly, and wish you all the best in the future. And I'll chat to you again soon.